Hi everyone, this is Tim at North and South Podcasts. As promised, this is the second part of my podcast with Amy and Emerson. However, it's only Emerson here today. We're going to focus on Emerson's story on comedy and neurodiversity. And then we're going to speak to Amy separately because I think they both had so much to say. We couldn't fit it into one episode. So we're going to do two follow-up episodes and then maybe a together episode in the near future about how things are going. Amy told us about postnatal depression, her EUPD, BPD, what we might call emotionally unstable personality disorder. I think I got that right, which is a very interesting diagnosis in terms of what it can tell people who experience certain symptoms in a certain way. And you then start to understand that and some of the difficulties she's faced. We also spoke to Emerson, who very articulately explained what it's like having autism, dyspraxia, issues with sensory perception, depth perception, and movement, and issues with his joints. The difficulties that he faces day to day doing things like stepping off a train, or the impact of the isolation of the pandemic, being in the house by themselves while being an undergraduate. Emerson was very, very calm, very, very kind of just informative about it. And I just thought I've never heard it, like what that's like, having those extra strains and stresses every day, just to get through the day. So Emerson Young, who is a stand-up comedian, is with us again. So Emerson, thank you so much for what you told us all last week, even though I think there's going to be 2 weeks between the original going out and this one going out. So first of all, how are you?
I'm all right, thanks. We've got a lot going on, but it's better to be busy than bored, I guess.
Yeah, just so listeners know, and also for you to know, I'm having a terrible week this week. I've got hay fever issues, which may be part of it, but I've been really down all week. I feel physically exhausted. I'm just having a really bad week to the point where I didn't actually feel like doing a podcast, but I kind of know that I need to do things to manage my situation. So this morning, I'm off work today. I did my journal. I went for a walk in the sun because it's a beautiful day. And my girlfriend said to me to do those two things. And she also said, do a podcast or go on the exercise bike. So I said, right, I'm going to proceed with this podcast. So I'm persevering today. So bear with me, Emerson, if I'm not quite myself and if I'm a bit, because that's how I feel inside. Although I feel a lot better now once I've got recording and speaking to your good self. So thanks for
That's good.
coming on. You are right. Sometimes you do need to
And
keep busy, and sometimes you need to do the things that make you feel better. Maybe you can mention some of those
yeah,
issues that are going on with you
because
at the moment a bit later. But
because but I've found with gigs, because my calendar's booked often quite a long way in advance. So if I'm not feeling up to, like, if I feel a bit rubbish, I'm like, oh, I don't want to get out of bed. I've kind of got to because I've got pre-existing commitments,
mm,
and it's actually quite helpful for me.
yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because you have that cap on when you're in bed. Oh, I don't want to do this. And then once you're up and doing it, you say, I'm glad that I had that to kind of make me do things. And I think that's what's important with routines sometimes, to give yourself those routines and those obligations where you have to do certain things, because otherwise you get caught in your negative mind frame, don't you? So, Emerson, I'm going to talk about a few things today. We're not really going to have a rigid structure to this, but we were going to discuss your path to comedy. You've told us about being an undergrad, how difficult that can be, the difficulty of isolation and COVID and the pandemic. And because of your autism, your dyspraxia, etc., other aspects of neurodiversity, how difficult you find day to day life, even though you get on with it because that's what people do. And it's great to see you're a stand up. It's great to see that you're at university, etc. So, where did the path to comedy come from for you?
Oh, I didn't realize it at the time, but when I was a younger kid, me and my mate used to make like little sketch videos and parody songs and stuff, and and film them, and like occasionally put them on YouTube and then delete them because they were too embarrassing, etc.
Yeah.
So I guess that's the very initial sort of, oh, I want to make funny things. I want to do stuff that people laugh at.
Yeah.
But I sort of, basically, about the age of 14, I had completely settled on the idea that I was going to be a games designer. I was going to, like, I had a path planned out for myself. I was going to be a games designer. I was going to go to a specific university to do a specific course in games design. And after I'd done that course, I was going to get a job working for one of the big games companies. Because obviously it seems simple when you're a kid, isn't it? Oh,
Yeah.
I'll get good at games, then I'll work for Nintendo. You know, that was what I assumed the pathway was. And once I'd got that sort of pathway established in my head, once I'd said, well, I'm going to do this, and then obviously everyone around you's like, oh, okay, you know, so you're wanting to go to uni and do this, we'll help you achieve that goal and follow that path. So it was just a series of jumping through hoops. You've got to get you've got to get your GCSEs so you can get your A levels, so you can go to uni and do games. And so I was just following that and following that and following that. And I think along the way, there came a point where I didn't really necessarily want to work for Nintendo or whoever anymore. But I was so lost in the path that I thought I wanted to go down. Because I used to make games as a hobby at school, and then I used to do it in my free time, and then I got to uni, and it suddenly wasn't a hobby anymore, and that kind of ruined it for me a
Yeah.
bit.
Did you do
But
games initially, your programming, or have you changed your course since then? Or
well, I did. I eventually ended up on an ill-advised master's degree, but the less said about that, the better, to be honest. But basically, what happened were I didn't have the required skills to go straight onto the games course. My portfolio wasn't good enough, so they put me on a sort of foundation year, which then felt like another hoop to jump through. But between the end of sixth form and the start of university, and this I think has really influenced my outlook on life and my perspective on life. One of my friends from school, fairly, close friend, we used to hang out 4 or 5 times a week, very sadly died by suicide when he was 15 and I was 18. Basically, I was having a bit of an existential crisis anyway because I was leaving school and there's all that. And then he died, and it made me, I was devastated, because up until that point as well, life almost felt like a bit of a trial run. Like, oh, I've got to do all this education stuff, and then I'll actually be a real person. And then he died, and he'd not even done his GCSEs,
yeah,
and it just made me think, well, it's what am I doing? What am I doing with my life? I think I felt quite guilty for a long time as well because I was struggling to adjust to uni, and it starting to feel like uni wasn't all I'd hoped it would be. On top of all that, I'm thinking, well, I'm here, I'm alive, I should be making the most of it. Why can't Noah do what I'm doing? Why can't he be experiencing the stuff that I have got the chance to experience? I felt guilty, I think. Well, basically to grow up, I felt like that opportunity was wasted on me and he should have had it instead. And so yeah, that affected me a lot. And I got through the foundation year because I had to, because I was on it, and it's been, the build up for it had been at that point years and years. Like most of my teenage years have been building up to getting on that course. So I got through the foundation year, and I was like, well, I'll get onto the games degree eventually, and that's what I've been really working towards. Once I get onto that, everything will be fine. Everything will work out. So I got into my first year, realised very quickly that it wasn't all I'd hoped, because I didn't really want to go into the games industry anymore. Making video games at school or in my grotty little teenage bedroom was a very different thing to actually having to meet deadlines and have your work assessed. And yeah, and I realised that quite quickly. I had a massive existential crisis. I was still absolutely reeling over what had happened to Noah, but also it was about a year on at that point, so everyone around you sort of expects you to have got over it. I struggled with not really knowing where I fitted in or what I was meant to be doing, to be honest, because I felt like I'd got where I wanted to be, and once I was there, I didn't know why I wanted to be there.
Yeah.
And I sort of went with it for a bit, and well, I don't know when exactly this happened or why this happened. I'd been a fan of stand-up comedy for a long time, but that's just sitting watching stand-up. I'd never thought, oh, I'd like to do this. I just thought, oh, that's something fun that other people can do. And then I don't know what clicked or why it clicked, but a bit of me went from, oh, I wish I could do that, but obviously I can't because it's not what I do. A bit, it went from that to suddenly, actually, why can't I do that? No idea why. There was no big revelation. The comedy god didn't come down and bestow all his wisdom on me. I just had that sort of flip in my brain from stand up as a thing that I enjoy watching, and it's something that I wish I could do in the same way that I wish I could draw like hyper realistic pictures, or I wish I could run really really fast. There's a difference between something you want to be able to do and you work to achieve that goal, and something that you think as a sort of daft little fantasy, oh, that would be fun, and then you put it out your mind. At some point, it switched from a daft little fantasy to actually, why can't I do that? So I started thinking, just in the back of my mind, trying to think up jokes and trying to think up little routines and thinking, well, if I were on stage, what would I say and would it be any good? That was, I think, a mental sort of turning point, because I was, really quite depressed. I wasn't having a great time at uni. I was having this massive existential crisis. And I think I latched on to stand up as something for me to sort of reinvent myself with, something for me to do that was maybe more suited to me than games, which at that point I was quite quickly realizing I didn't actually necessarily want.
Do you know the way that you found you had that creativity and you like to make funny videos when you were young, and you've got a story to tell, maybe you suddenly comedy appeals to you? Were there any particular influences in the comedy world that kind of inspired you at that stage?
I mean, I would just be mostly listing off sort of late noughties, early 2010s memes and things, but
Yeah.
because I used to watch stand up, like live at the Apollo type stand
Yeah.
up.
I mean, when I was young, I'm a bit of a
Compilation
joker.
shows.
I'm a bit of a joker, and I've never considered comedy. But I've got a friend who says jokes, and I just look at him sometimes and go, "Where did that come from? That's brilliant. It's genius. He's got that mind." People have said that about me, the way I come up with random jokes, which I think is probably to do with my neurodiversity to a degree. But I mean, I remember watching Richard Pryor doing his classic stand up in the mid 70s, where he's got the red shirt and the gold shoes, and thinking that is really funny. Chris Rock called it the greatest like stand up of all time, and I used to look at that and think that's so good. And there's been others I've watched since then. I'm not really a natural into me comedy, but young people today, it's different, isn't it? Because you've got like YouTube and even TikTok for the really modern, where the whole nature of comedy is different, where it's not necessarily about a person standing on a stage. Is that right? Is that where things are now?
Yeah, because you've been talking about like proper classic stand-up. I'm about to shit all over that and say I used to like watching cartoon animated videos by a man called Coit.
How do you spell that?
Koit.
Coit, right.
I mean, it's juvenile, absolutely juvenile, mostly about poo. If they're not about poo, they're about bums, usually about bums doing a poo. And if the bums aren't doing a poo, the bums are probably farting. It's but the animation quality is hilarious. Like they're spot on for what they are. They're spot on. They're the most annoying videos you could ever hope to watch. But as like a 13-year-old, 14-year-old, they're brilliant. So I used to watch shit like that and we used to try and make our own versions of that. So we used to make our own little fireworks animated cartoons. I don't know why we animated fireworks. If anyone knows fireworks, they know it can potentially be used for animation, but it's not, maybe not the go-to.
Yeah.
I suppose it was the only thing that wasn't blocked in our school, but we used to try and animate our own videos. Like me and a friend had, we had a video about a guy who picked up the phone and dialed 99999 and said, "Hello, there's been an emergency. I farted." And then the police officer says, "Oh my God, I can't believe it. Oh Jesus, oh no, oh God, we'll send a squad car immediately, sir." And then the guy's like, "Please hurry, I think it's going to happen again." And then he farts again and the world explodes.
Yeah.
And in our eyes, we were going to make this video and it was going to look professional and we were going to put it on YouTube and we were going to become millionaires.
I've just looked at
What
Coit.
actually happened was we animated one scene and then we got bored and went off to like play Mario Kart or some shit.
Yeah. But that's the creative process, though, isn't it? Because I've just looked at Coit I've just Googled it actually, and I've seen some of them Coits, so I recognise it. But I think that the idea of comedy, I mean, I remember when I was really young watching like Reeves and Mortimer and just thinking, this isn't funny. And now I look at Reeves and Mortimer and think it's brilliant. And I think comedy, it's very much in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? And I watched a great film recently about
What do
Andy
you mean, Man
Kaufman.
on the Moon?
Andy
Yeah, I was
Kaufman.
gonna say I can go through all of the song Man on the Moon.
Yeah, I think
Like,
I watched the film recently about Andy Kaufman, the comedian from the 60s or 70s. And he was very like offbeat left field at the time. And I watched that film and I was laughing at some of his stuff. And I think that kind of comedy, again, everyone's different, but that kind of comedy, it challenges all your preconceptions. Do you know what I mean? And I remember hearing a story about Richard Pryor once where he was doing stand-up in Las Vegas, like for like middle class people in the audience. And one day he just walked off the stage and said, I can't live with this. This is just nonsense. And then he did the comedy that was true to him. Do you know what I mean? And became
yeah,
a bit of a world star on the back of that. But that kind of discovery of the comedy that you find funny and that process of finding that's quite subjective, isn't it?
because there was the daft weird internet things I watched at school that I also had a sort of really bizarre eclectic mix of like sitcom tastes, and I was really into classic sitcoms like Dad's Army, Open All Hours, I was really into the Chuckle Brothers as well. I
Yeah,
loved
they
the
were good.
Chuckle Brothers. To be honest, I think it helped that they were from Yorkshire
Yeah.
because not very many people are from Yorkshire. There was Chuckle Brothers. There was Norman Wisdom. I was proper into Norman
Yeah.
Wisdom. So I was like, for context, I was like 16, and my mates introduced me to Norman Wisdom. So I'm sat watching him, black and white films from the 60s. Just a bit weird, to be honest, but I liked those. I liked the sort of
Yeah.
like the kind of comedy that comes from misunderstandings
Yeah.
and the sort of slapstick stuff, and yeah.
Yeah, it's funny, innit? Eric Morecambe, when I was young, again, Eric Morecambe and Wise would be on, and I didn't really get it. And then now and again, they'll have an old episode on, and Eric Morecambe, he is just a genius, absolutely in stitches, with that kind of like just being a little bit crazy, you know what I mean? And finding comedy in your own way. And again, there's not one way of doing it. I mean, I've seen Matt Jones do stand up who introduced you and Amy to me, and he's quite offbeat, left field, isn't he? And like, you know, quite offbeat. And I've seen Claire Berry as well, who does Femme de la Femme, who we spoke to on a previous podcast, do comedy. And appreciating comedy and laughing at things. I mean, I love going on YouTube and looking at funny things like reporter swallows insect, probably one of the funniest things I've ever seen. And the woman who gets bronchitis when she goes out to get a cold pop, you know, those little videos that you keep going back to and you find hilarious. But there's a difference between that and actually getting up on a stage, which takes a lot of bottle. I haven't been to much comedy. I've seen heckling before, and I've seen people giving someone a rough time. And appreciating comedy and saying, oh, I want to do that, and then actually doing it, that's a big step up, isn't it? So how did you find that? And how did you find your voice on the stage, if you like?
Like I said, my kind of influences were all a bit all over the place because I was interested in sketches as well. I wanted to write a sketch show for a long time, like just write it and perhaps do bit parts in it. Kind of in the vein of you've probably not heard of it because it was a kids show in the noughties. But sorry, I've got no head. Was
No, I haven't heard
like
of it.
and it was a sketch show for kids and young teenagers, but it wasn't like it wasn't like a gentle children's kind of thing. It was wacky, daft character, just absurd characters. My favorite was a woman who would say blueberries, and every time she said blueberries, there was a fart noise and her hair went up in the air like wee. So she'd say blueberries, and it was the most again juvenile, but really, really funny. So for a while, I wanted to do stuff like that, but when I actually, when I realised that stand up was potentially something I could do, I thought, well, what I've got to do is I've got to learn how to do stand up. So I googled how to do stand up comedy. There's lots of information when you type how to do stand up comedy. None of it's actually going to teach you how to do
Yeah.
it. There's little bits and pieces here and there you can take away from, but all in all, it's you that needs to do it. Like the internet can't teach you, a book can't teach you. They can help, but they can't teach you. And I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll start writing a set and I'll get a slot at an open mic. So I started writing my set and I planned to go and do my first ever open mic in April 2020. And we all know what happened to April 2020. I wasn't doing very much in April 2020.
Yeah. I mean, open mic. I've seen open mic nights where literally anyone can stand up, and I've actually read a couple of poems once at an open mic night, and it is a good way of like introducing yourself and seeing how things go. But in April 2020, obviously, lockdown happened. So did that put things on hold, and what happened then?
Yeah, obviously it wasn't ideal, but I was stressed out. I mean, I've touched on this. I was stressed out not knowing what was actually going to happen because there's all, oh, it's all right, it'll only be for a few weeks. And then suddenly you're a year in and there's no sign of it ending.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to do stand-up. I wanted to try it. So I was like, well, I'll just write during lockdown, and then when it ends, I'll be able to get out there and do stand-up. So I started writing. So I was for quite a few weeks, I was actually living completely alone, and I was writing stand-up to sort of distract me from. And basically, I was just watching Taskmaster on repeat and writing stand-up. And when I wasn't writing, I was thinking. I was all in my own head. And to be honest, maybe that did me some good because up until that point, especially as I said before, with what happened to Noah, and I'd basically been keeping myself really busy, just filling every minute of free time so that I didn't have to think about anything.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you can't do that because I was never in my flat. I was always out. I was out down at the train station, taking pictures of trains, getting on trains in town with my mates, whatever. I was always doing something because I felt like I had to be. And then lockdown happened, and suddenly I couldn't do that. So I had a lot of time to think, and I had a lot of time to reflect, and I had a lot of time to suddenly and involuntarily process everything that I'd been trying my best to ignore about Noah as well, which ultimately I did need to process. Like, I'm not sure I'd be a particularly healthy person now if the pandemic hadn't happened and I was still trying to avoid thinking about it. When the pandemic happened and there was nothing else to do, I stopped trying to avoid thinking about him and let myself just grieve properly. Because up till that point, I'd been trying to avoid the grief and everything that comes with that. It wasn't even a month into the pandemic. It wasn't far into the pandemic. My grandma actually died, and then I had lots of complicated feelings about her as well. So I was sort of double grieving, trying to deal with feelings about, because it's feelings about death and it's also feelings about the people who've died, and they were two very different sets, well, three very different sets of feelings, because you've got the feelings about death in general.
So you'd had like a double grief, if you like, Emerson, and you're still processing one, and then the other one comes along, and you've got lockdown going on, and there's obviously a lot going on at that stage, isn't it?
I think, to be honest, the time and the opportunity that I had to go over that in lockdown, I think did sort of help in a way. I think if lockdown hadn't happened, I wouldn't have had that opportunity to really properly come to terms with how I was feeling and come to terms with also the fact that I couldn't have changed anything with Noah, and I couldn't have done anything. And that I think I knew deep down anyway, but it took me a while to really accept it.
I think that lockdown as well, that there's a lot of thinking time as part of that. And as you said, it can feel like too much, but it can also help you to process things. Where did the stand-up come from that then? Because you were going to go to an open mic night and then you couldn't. So did you slowly get back out there or get in there, if you like, when things started to reopen? How did that process work?
Well, I basically started writing during lockdown. I wrote loads of stuff, all of which has since been binned. And I watched loads of stand-up and I watched loads of sitcoms. Favorite sitcom over lockdown was Man Down by Greg Davis.
Hmm.
I'd seen bits of it in the past, but I didn't really watch telly. And then lockdown happened and there was nothing else to do. So I watched loads of telly. So I watched Man Down. I watched that. I think it's like four series. I can't remember how much of it there is, but I watched every episode of that, one after the other. And I started writing my own stuff. I actually started writing my own sitcoms because I couldn't do stand up. So I was like, well, I'll write a sitcom. But what I really wanted to do was I wanted to get up there and show people what I'd got and get that immediate sort of feedback that you get from being on stage. That's what I really wanted to
Mhm.
do. I'm just trying to think when the lockdown actually ended because it were kind of
There was some July 1st reopenings, wasn't there, of 2020?
yeah.
And then I think there was
Yeah,
a
no,
mini
I'm not count.
lockdown.
There was nothing in 2020 that
Yeah,
actually lasted because they fucked
yeah,
it.
yeah.
Yeah, there was a few kinds of things might be starting to get on the move again in 2020, but that was very short-lived
Yeah. It
from
was
what I
effectively a
remember.
full year, wasn't it, of messing from the first lockdown to the second full lockdown in the UK. That was from March
I don't know,
20 to March
because
21.
for me it feels like longer than a year because my whole first year of university was written off
Yeah,
and my whole second year was online.
yeah.
And when I went into third year, there was still all the precautions and stuff in
Mm.
place, but at least you could go to a nightclub and lick people afterwards. It's funny because uni they had like a one-way system and you all had to wear masks and everything.
Yeah.
But then you can go to the lead mill after and go wild with thousands of people crammed into the same space, swimming in each other's bile. I reckon it wasn't really until sort of summer 2021. I'm gonna say summer 2021 was when things really started to feel like the world was starting to get back to some form of normality for me personally. Because some things were reopening earlier than that, and you were allowed to socialize in groups again. But I'd say summer 2021 was the point where it felt like for me, yeah, everything's sort of starting to feel like we can get back to how the world used to be or similar.
So how did you get onto the into the actual stand up then from that point? Because
So I'd
that's still a big leap,
say,
isn't it?
yeah, but I'd say at that point I could have potentially got into stand up.
Hmm.
But because I'd spent so long writing and so long going over in my head what I'd do if I did stand up, at that I was like, well, I've got to do it properly now, otherwise, and what if I'm shit? Because I've been working towards this for so long. If I'm rubbish at it, I've wasted all that time. I could have started then, but like a big chicken, I actually didn't have the guts to go to an open mic until months later. Basically, I Googled open mics. Lots of them had shut down because of COVID or changed because of COVID, and I was struggling to find any in Yorkshire. So I actually ended up finding one in Liverpool, Hotwater Comedy Club. And I didn't want to have to sign up for anything in advance. I wanted to just be able to turn up on the night and get on because I didn't want the commitment of signing up for something in advance. So I eventually worked up the courage. I mean, I'd found some open mics, but I'd not actually gone to any, and I eventually forced myself to go and do it 31st of January 2022, and it was because I wanted to enter a competition, and the deadline for that was a couple of days after. It was like the start of February. So I did stand up for the first time in 2022. It was terrible. I forgot half my jokes. I didn't realise that you were allowed to bring a notebook up, so I was trying to remember it all out of my head and failing miserably. And I was obviously, my stage presence was terrible because I was terrified. And then I did my second gig, I think actually the day after or 2 days after or something, again in Liverpool. No idea why Liverpool. There were a lot of gigs at that time, and there still are in Liverpool. But I lived in Sheffield. I've got no clue why I couldn't find something closer. And I eventually started finding gigs in Manchester as well. But yeah, so I started in Liverpool because the Hot Water open mic was the first one I found when I Googled open mics.
But that first one was difficult, but you learned from that, didn't you? And then how did you find the second night and the third night? Did you find you like refining things? And
Yeah, and I also took notes up for the second
hmm.
one because I realised that that was allowed. And I recorded the second one and actually submitted that for a competition that I wanted to enter and got through to the semi-finals. So that was worth it. I found also as time went on, I got more, because when I first started, the jokes I did were quite kind of impersonal, quite like they weren't about me, they weren't linked to my life or my experiences or anything, and they were, all sort of fictional events that happened in this kind of wacky alter ego sort of life kind of thing. I don't know what made me start doing this, but I started talking more about me,
Yeah.
and I started talking about the fact that I'm autistic, the fact that I'm queer, the fact that I'm dyspraxic. I started integrating it in a little bit and started talking about myself more, and that was when people actually started telling me, "Oh yeah, your set's quite good. I like your
Yeah.
stuff. Keep doing what you're doing." And that was the sort of point where I actually started developing some sort of a voice, I think, because when I first started, there was absolutely no trace of any authenticity, really.
Yeah.
And I think you need some authenticity as a comedian. Even if you're doing a character act, you
Yeah.
need it to be authentic and you need it to be believable. Even if it's not you, even if it's a character, the audience need to believe the character. And when I first started, it wasn't believable and it wasn't authentic. It was just this nervous kid trying to be a bit edgy.
So did
And
you have I mean, Richard Pryor was doing like, comedy that he didn't particularly like, but he was funny and people laughed at him and he said, no, this isn't me. And he can't. So you're kind of going up trying to be funny using like alter ego, slightly like different characters. Your first
I
night, you
wouldn't
go, oh,
even
God, that didn't go too well. You refine it, you use notes, and then you
I,
use your authentic voice, and then you get that positive
I,
feedback.
I wouldn't even say it was different characters. I'd just say it was like stories that I'd made up that I said, "Oh yeah, I did this the other day," and the whole audience knows that 100% didn't happen. And then I'd say, "Oh yeah, I did," because I was trying to be like other comedians that I'd seen or tell a little story, and I was like, "Well, I'll tell a story," but I didn't really have the story there to tell, so I was making stuff up. And I think I've got to a point now where I can build on things that are true and add things that aren't true,
Yeah.
but still have it sound believable and still have it feel like something that could really have happened to me,
Yeah,
which I couldn't do before because I just didn't have the confidence and I didn't
yeah.
have the ability because I wasn't that experienced at stand up. I'd say since I started actually talking about autism, and I think I started talking about autism on its own for a while, and then I drew dyspraxia into it as well a bit later. But since I started doing that, I started to see my act as, I mean, primarily it's for me because I want to get up there and say shit and hopefully it's funny.
So did you bring in aspects of queer life as well as the dyspraxia and the autism?
Yeah. And it was very shallow. It was mostly dick jokes. It still is mostly dick jokes, but I basically, because obviously you start doing stand up and then you see other people doing stand up as well. So I saw other new comedians who were also talking about their life experiences. And it made me think, well, I can do that. Because up until then, I hadn't really considered it. I'd thought, well, I have to be like all the other comedians I've seen, like I have to be like all the famous comedians I've seen on telly. I hadn't really thought outside of that. And then seeing other open micers doing their sets actually gave me a bit of perspective on what I could be doing on the stages that I was performing on rather than hypothetically if I was on Live at the Apollo.
Where you're on now, you've been recognised as someone who's good. You're very much on the circuit now. How did things expand for you after the initial kind of success of making the semi-final or people telling you that you were funny?
No, I wouldn't say I'm on the circuit. I'd say I'm an open mic comedian, and every now and again I do a slightly bigger gig than what I usually do. I
Yeah.
wouldn't say I've actually.
But you get gigs around the country, don't you, in different places, and you go to gigs and you do comedy, don't you? So you've obviously got a lot more confidence now than say how you had in the past.
Yeah, I'd say that.
One other thing I wanted to mention while you're thinking of that, and this might be a way in for you, is just what you think the role of comedy is. And there's no one role for comedy, but to what do you think comedy is what's its role? Just that might help you to fit in what you were going to say. That was the only other thing I wanted to really explore, but take your time. What your comedy is and why it's important, and like the lived experience of things, for example, and getting people to laugh at things, and but also to learn about things and to be able to turn the lens on yourself might be like how comedy is for you. But also like just a wider discussion on what is comedy. It was you don't have to go down that route, but it might
Yeah,
just be like what do you think your comedy is and why do you think it's important?
I think my comedy for me is primarily I enjoy doing it, so I want to go on stage and tell jokes because I want to make people laugh because it's something that I really like to do.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I have had people approach me after gigs and say, "Oh, I'm autistic," or "I'm dyspraxic," or and I really liked to hear you talk about that.
Yeah.
I've not seen anyone do that before, and it made me feel included.
Yeah.
And those interactions have made me sort of think about how important stand up can potentially be to people from marginalized communities and people who don't often see others who are like themselves or have things in common with them represented in media and arts and stuff. It because I didn't ever see me doing stand up as like a way to give back to any to my sort of community or anything. And I never
Yeah.
saw it as that kind of that's not why I do it necessarily, but it's a nice thing to be contributing to.
Yeah, it's not a reason in itself, is it, to say, oh, I want to tell my story and my experiences and my lived experiences. That's a separate thing to comedy. But if you go up there to be funny and you find a voice and people think you are funny and you have got a voice, and then you tell people about lived experience, that's helpful. Because again, when I was young, you had a little bit of people who might have been LGBTQ or whatever on Channel 4. Maybe you might have a bit of a comedy program where that was addressed, but it is so much more out there now than it used to be. Mental health is another big thing. I think that people talking about mental health through comedy as well, that's important, particularly given the fact that there's been studies saying that a lot of people who have issues with mental health and well-being are comedians, or comedians have a higher proportion of which are people with, I haven't explained that very well, with well-being and mental health issues. So I think that there's a link between them both. But I think that getting those stories out there is one thing, but it does have to be funny, and it does have to have something to say that makes people laugh, whatever that is. And it can be absurd stuff, but it gets a message out. It's like political comedy. I mean, I listen to the Scottish comedian who does that series on BBC with the red hair, what's his name, Frankie Boyle. It does like political comedy, and I really like that. And I can understand them winding people up who don't necessarily agree with him, but he uses comedy, which is really funny, but also as a message. And again, you don't have to do your comedy like that because everyone's different. But I think if you can do that, that helps you find your inner voice, doesn't it? And it's natural to you, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, I've basically, I don't want to be like an inspirational kind of, oh wow, look at this guy, he's autistic, but he can do comedy despite that. I don't want to be used like inspiration porn, but I don't necessarily like it when people come up to me after gigs and say, oh my God, I think you're great because it's really brave for you to be doing this because you're autistic. Because I have had people come up to me and they mean well, but it can be really patronising. I don't really like it when people are like, oh wow, basically saying to me that they think the reason it's amazing that I do stand-up is that I'm neurodivergent and disabled and whatever else. And they're like, well, it's amazing that you can do that despite who you are. I don't like that, but I think that's an occupational hazard, really. And it's worth it to have people actually approaching me and saying, I can relate to that personally, and it's made me feel good about myself. I think that's what I'm going for. That's what I'd like to have more of in terms of the audience response. Is I want people to feel represented and included. But I think, like I said, an occupational hazard of that is you do then get people who think you're inspirational and want to tell you how inspirational you are. And they mean well, but it's not necessarily the right sort of thing to be saying.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I think it's a fine line as well, because people do mean well when they say, "Oh, it's great that you're doing this," and you think, "Well, okay," but not that everyone wants to be told the same thing. But you want to be told, "Oh, by the way, your comedy is really good, and I like the way that you're doing that and mentioning those things because they're important things." Do you know what I mean? And again, it's only when you're on the other side of things that you really appreciate the differences in that approach. Because you don't want to be like told, "Oh, you're good," because someone says to me, "Oh yeah, it's good. We need more Scousers teaching." And you go, I'd rather someone said, "You're a good teacher, and it's great to hear a Scouse accent as well." You know what I mean, kind of thing. And by the way, no one ever says that to me anymore, but it's all good. But I think that role, whatever that role is, that voice that you find, you want it to be authentic, but you're also you don't want to be told because of a disability or whatever, that's why it's good that you're doing something. It shouldn't be about that, should it? And I get that when people say things. I mean, people say things to me sometimes, and you go, "Well, you mean well there." And I say things to people, and they go, "Well, I know you mean well, but you go, oh yeah, I didn't see that." Do you know what I mean? But that's important, isn't it? But it is good that you hear those voices because, you know, I remember hearing, like, seeing films with gay characters and stuff in the 80s, and that was quite big at the time. You know what I mean? And making those breakthroughs. But to see comedians saying, like, let's discuss all these issues, but that's not why people are watching me, because I'm discussing those issues. People are watching me because I'm funny, I'm stand-up, and by the way, talking about those issues, kind of thing. Is that like kind of where you're coming from?
Yeah, I did. I once did a gig, and after the gig, a guy comes up to me and he says, "Oh, you were really good. You were amazing, especially since you're." And then he just sort of gestured at me like,
As if he didn't want to say it.
I think he wanted to say, especially since you're disabled, but he didn't want to. Like, he was avoiding it like it was a dirty word. I really enjoyed your set. I think you were really good, especially since.
But again, he means well, doesn't he? But
yeah,
I do it myself sometimes. Like I say now, like, you know, like describing someone. I've seen this, but a comedian refer to this, which is why I always do it. Like, you know, if I'm describing someone, I go, you know, that black gentleman. Whereas in the past, you might have said, you know, that gentleman over there, you don't want to say black as if, but yeah, that black gentleman, that's fine. It's okay to say what people are and use it, even if other people might use that in a negative way.
It's the same way with like visible disabilities as well. Like, I've seen so many people try to describe mates of mine who are like in wheelchairs, but they don't want to say, "Oh yeah, the girl in the wheelchair." They'll say, "Oh, such and such. She's got blonde hair," and it's like there's four different girls with blonde hair, and only one of them's in a wheelchair. And as far as I'm concerned, the easiest way to get across who you're talking about is to just properly describe her.
Yeah. You had the situation last week as well where Amy said someone introduced someone to her and said, "Oh, by the way, she's queer," about this other game. You know what I mean? Like, when'd you say it? So, Emerson, what's next for you moving forward then? What's the future hold for you? What are you planning to do?
Well, I've got sort of short-term goals and long-term goals, I'd say. And in the longer term, I'm wanting to write more material and get like a half hour, etc. of material together and start doing bigger shows and start applying for, more actual paid gigs. And in the shorter term, I'm in the final of the Chortle Student Comedy Award, which is in London in July. And I'm also, as part of that, I get to play Latitude Festival.
Brilliant.
Really looking forward to that. Terrifying, but I'm looking forward to that. And then in August, I've got the Edinburgh Fringe coming up. I'm doing a split bill show with Kyle Bedder. It's a sort of collaborative kind of thing. So it's not like I do some material, he does some material. We're both on stage at the same time doing like improv combined with stand-up and like audience interaction around pre-written material. So it's sort of like a hybrid of stuff. So we'll see how that goes. That's running in Edinburgh from the 12th of August to the 27th of August. And the show's called Method versus Madness. So if anyone's interested, come along. It's free. It's at 5:15 every day at Cocktail Mafia.
Cocktail Mafia?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I've been to Edinburgh Festival a few times. It is really good, particularly if you've not been before, getting into it all and seeing different shows. But that's great stuff.
It's so much fun to just go around and watch lots of different shows, because that's what I did last year for.
Yeah, I mean, the festival is brilliant. I'd recommend anyone go to it. And you can go to free events, you can go to paid events, you can go to quite cheap paid events. And I've really loved it. So if you've got any details as well, Emerson, written details or website details, and like that, we can put that down as well. But I would urge
Oh
people to
yeah,
check
yeah.
that out and
I'll
support
pass
yourself.
them on.
Good stuff. Right, Emerson, thank you so much for your time today, and good luck with the gig tonight. And thanks for giving us last week the lived experience of autism and dyspraxia, and also in this episode for telling us about your journey into comedy and stand-up and how you found your voice, how you found your kind of comedy niche, as it were, and found yourself in that regard. And also how you've dealt with the traumas of loss of a close friend, relative, and the impact of COVID and the pandemic and isolation, and the impact on the comedy circuit as well, which held things back. And I think they're important stories, particularly the COVID thing. I don't think we can even begin to get our head around the long-term impact of the pandemic and the lockdowns, etc. And also just thanks for the little chat about comedy. I'm into me comedy. It's good to talk about things with someone who knows what they're talking about. So thank you very much for your time. Anything else you want to add or say before we finish?
No, I'm chill. I'll send you some details about obviously the Edinburgh show, and in the future as well, if there's anything that I think anyone will be interested in, I'll pass it on to you, because I am quite interested in the possibility of setting up a comedy night for disabled people or for neurodiverse people.
Brilliant. Sounds really good.
So I'd like to do that. So if that is ever actually becoming a reality, I'll pass the details on to you so you can share them. I mean, your audience are going to be interested in that, I'd assume.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still very much in its infancy, but it is something that I'd really like to do if I can.
Definitely, and best of luck with that moving forward, and I'm happy to share any details. Emerson, good luck with the gig tonight. Thanks for coming on, and great to hear what you've got to say, and best of luck with your stand-up moving forward. Cheers.